Good evening, everyone. Hello. Sorry, I'm hoping I'm at the end of a sneezing fit. I don't have a cold. I think people must have been cutting their grass today. And when I usually start a bit of sneezing, it goes on. So we're going to discuss Labour's first week in terms of what they've actually done. There's a great deal that they say they've done, which is, largely PR. But things like announcing the Wealth Fund and the Border Force has not been done. They've just announced it, but they also announced it before the election. So I don't count that as doing something. But there is plenty they have done. I mean, there's only so much they can do. Remember, most of what they need to do requires legislation and or funding. And Parliament's, Parliament's not in session yet. It's not going to be in session properly for a while. The state opening of Parliament is next week. And then you have several, that's when Labour present their King's Speech. Because they're presenting a really big one, I tell you what, anyone who's been watching Parliament over the last couple of years, and if you're watching it over the next couple of years, you're going to see something very different. Because over the last couple of years, Parliament's hardly done anything. It's hardly passed any legislation at all. It's been finishing early most days. That's going to be very different. Labour are planning something like 30 bills, which would be like the most. That's more than there were in 2010 or 1997, whatever. So they're going to be quite busy. But ministers do have some powers and they can do some things immediately. So I'll go over those. There have been a couple of interesting questions asked there that are slightly off topic. I've clipped one of them, like Punninator's got a good question. I'll hopefully come back to that because I do have an answer to that one. So let's just go through what I think Labour have actually done. Yeah, I'm trying an experiment. Sorry, I just keep wiping my nose. The £10 Starmer scores the winning goal tomorrow night. He called me cynical, but he may have to join the Spanish team for that. I don't mind. Do you know what? I'm a lot of people complaining about. Or saying like, oh, Southgate has to win to like secure this legacy or something. I'm thinking, who are you comparing him to? I'm 48 years old. So basically, I would have been about 40 when he was made the manager. He's been a manager for a long time. But still, in the previous 40 years of my life, what did we get? We had one World Cup semi-final and one Euro semi-final. That was it. Quarterfinals was the best other than that. One World Cup semi-final, one Euro semi-final in like my entire life. Gareth Southgate comes along. We have a World Cup semi-final and 2 Euro finals. I would say he's already secured some sort of legacy and should probably be knighted. If you're going to knight people for anything, why not? But anyway. So what have Labour done in my estimation? So this is what I think they've actually done. Sorry, this is really annoying. I hate having sneezing fits just before I come on. So, formally ended the Rwanda plan. I mean, we know the Rwanda plan never got going in the first place. Rishi Sunak wasn't sending anyone to Rwanda. Well, he was sending a few volunteers. But that has been ended, and that was ended quite quickly. Surprise, surprise, the Rwandan government said they're not going to give us our money back. If you recall, they were saying things like, look, we'd rather just give you the money back. This is too much hassle. But, that was just them doing what Rishi Sunak wanted to do for whatever reason. Surprise, surprise, they said, yeah, you're not having your money back. We've kept our end of the bargain, which I suppose they have. Ended the effective ban on onshore wind. That just took a few clicks of a button, or from Ed Miliband's point of view, a stroke of a pen. Obviously, a civil servant would have actually actioned it. But that is done now. And what surprised me, the next one, I didn't expect. This is where they've gone a bit further than I expected. So there's been 3 projects now basically given approval. It's one of those. Obviously, the wind farm doesn't spring up overnight. But I was quite surprised about that. What are my thoughts on the fact Labour have managed to ruin the prison system? Robert Buckland was saying on Nick Ferrari's show Monday. Yeah, it's a good one. Good one. It's funny how the prison system was working in 2010 and is not now. And apparently it's all Labour's fault after being in power for like 2 minutes. Robert Buckland is one of those, I would say, when people say, oh, there are some decent Tories. There are some decent Tories. And I don't like to jump on the bandwagon of no, they're all terrible people. But if in a few years ago, if you'd have said, well, show me a decent Tory then, you would point to people like Robert Buckland and Tom Tugendhat, right? And yet both of them are deliberately debasing themselves over this prisons thing. They know that they were releasing, and I'll tell you a difference with the prison thing, because that's one of the things on this list anyway. So Labour, because they're going at it before, they're not like, they've got a few weeks. They don't have very long. I think that the plan is to start doing these early releases in September. So they've got a bit of time. And they've clearly identified who should be released in terms of, they've said no one convicted of serious violent offences, despite the fact the Express are putting the emphasis on violent offenders, no one who's been convicted of a sexual offence at all, and no one who's been convicted of domestic abuse, which includes stalking. So we're not talking violent domestic abuse, wife beater or anything. Even a stalking offence doesn't get you out. And I'll tell you why. People like Robert Buckland and Tom Tugendhat and the media that are pushing all this as well, is you can imagine people reading the news about these releases who have been the victims of a sexual assault or domestic abuse. In other words, the sort of victim who may well have been a victim of crime, of quite a violent crime, by someone known personally to them, right? Case of domestic abuse, of course. And you could imagine they'd be quite worried about hearing news like that. It is irresponsible in the extreme to be presenting this news in such a political way and causing undue distress when Labour have made it very clear no one will be released early who has been convicted of a sexual offence or domestic abuse or a violent crime that resulted in a sentence above whatever it was, 4 years and something. And also the fact, and Labour will keep doing this because the Tories we knew that they were releasing prisoners early. And the way the Tories were doing it is they were waiting for the prisons to be literally full, because then what they were doing was telling judges to stop sentencing. So criminals stopped going to prison. Police had to stop charging people while they then made room. That was how the Tories were managing it, with no plan to increase prison capacity, but they were still talking about increasing the length of sentences. Even if you have the same level of crime, if you increase the length of sentences, you will increase the prison population. If you're not building new prison capacity, like, it's simple maths. It's an absolute outrage. An outrage. And I'm glad that Labour have come out and said, Rishi Sunak released 10,000 odd prisoners early. And they're going to do it with other things as well, because Labour have made a big show this week of, we've come in and it's way worse than we expected. And I know, and I said this before the election, didn't I? That's what they should do. And that people would say, oh, you knew how bad it was. Don't talk shit. But they can do that because there are reports that ministers have access to that haven't been published. Some may never be published. Some just may not have been published yet. So there are genuinely things that Labour will have gone in and seen for the first time. Not everything is known to the public, and not everything that will be known to the public in time was known at the point of view of the election. So Labour can absolutely go in and say this is way worse than we thought and release figures. Like, they've published the figures on how many prisoners the Tories released early. You know, they can start to publish other figures as well, because, you know, Labour will not only need, and they've all been doing this, you know, Rachel Reeves has made a big show of this week. Keir Starmer's made it. Shabana Mahmood definitely made it. Oh my God, she went crazy. You know, she called Rishi Sunak and his government the guilty men. You know, she was really laying it on thick. And, you know, it's important for Labour to at the next election say we've fixed all these things, but there's still more to fix. But they have to keep people remembering who broke it. Who broke it? It wasn't COVID. It wasn't Putin. The Tories broke these things. And that's what they should do. Yeah, Phil saying they both sell their souls to the party. I wouldn't even say that. I think it's worse than that. Because when I said a few years ago you could have pointed to Robert Buckler and Tom Tugendhat as relatively decent Tories, I mean literally that. So they sold their souls, as you describe it, at a time when it looked like the Tory project was going to collapse anyway. So this wasn't like years ago. This was like in the last couple of years, where it should have been obvious that the direction the Tories were going in was going to break them. Now, what they could have done was to steer well clear of it, wait for the inevitable car crash, and then say, well, we said this wasn't the right thing. And they now could have been voices of reason in the Conservative Party. They could have been the voices saying, we deserved to lose, and we deserved to lose because we behaved like scoundrels, and that's not the Conservative way. They could have done that, and they've decided not to. And even after the election, they're still deciding to play the game because they think that and they're probably right, that the next leader to come in is going to play that game, that blame game. And yet they should also know that whoever comes in next is also going to fail. You know, those two people should be aware, if they've got any brains at all, and I do credit them with brains, they should know that the Conservatives are not going to recover their reputation until they disown their own behaviour. Because Labour have shown this week they are going to keep reminding people who caused all this. And I'll tell you something else. They're going to keep releasing information. So, Keir Starmer's been really going on this week, and Rachel Reeves, about how it's not just incompetence, but corruption. They're talking about the corruption during COVID with the PPE contracts and so on, profiting at everyone else's expense. Labour are going to keep going on that. They're going to keep going on at that. So until the Conservatives accept that some people that they had at the top, then there we go. Howling Mad Murdoch there. Phil, do I think Labour will bring in media reform, Levinson, during his return to power? I do. Says it's desperately need to stop the lies, false propaganda. I do. I'll tell you why I do. Well, there's two reasons why I do. The first is that we know that Keir Starmer really believes in it because, remember, he was, as DPP, the one who really went after journalists over the phone hacking, journalists and editors over the phone hacking. And remember, he didn't actually get many convictions. Now with the Crown Prosecution Service, you obviously have to weigh up several things when you're deciding whether you're going to take a case to court. You have to weigh up the public interest, and you have to weigh up the probability of securing a conviction. And sometimes something can be powerfully in the public interest, but if you don't think the evidence is strong enough to secure a conviction, you have to say, well, we're wasting resources here. And yet, when you look at what was actually quite a poor conviction rate for the people he charged, so you could tell he was he was emphasizing the public interest angle more than the likelihood of securing convictions. He did secure some convictions, not really many, and certainly not the big ones, not the big fish. He didn't get Piers Morgan. He didn't get Rebecca Brooks. So there's that side of it. But then the other side, which heartened me, was the news that in the final week of the campaign, the Times they were going to endorse Labour, but then they refused. And the reason was that when the editor met with Keir Starmer, they asked him, are you going to guarantee no press reforms? And Starmer wouldn't give him that guarantee. Now, there's nothing in the manifesto about it. He's not talked about press reforms in terms of a policy. There's nothing on the Labour website about it that I can see. And given that Starmer was not at all being complacent and giving up votes, and he knew it was going to be very tight in a lot of seats, and he wanted as many seats as possible. You do not give up an endorsement in a paper like The Times. And remember, you may not be aware, because I read a lot of these things. The Times newspaper has not really been a backer of the crazy over the last few years. They were not really a supporter of, I mean, they wanted people to vote Conservative, but they were no friend of Boris Johnson. They've not been a fan of Liz Truss or even a lot of what Rishi Sunak's done. You still read their stuff and it's still clearly a Conservative paper, but it's a Conservative paper that recognised that the Conservative Party was getting it all wrong. So it wasn't a natural supporter of the Conservatives as they are now. So Keir Starmer would have valued their endorsement, is what I'm saying. And yet he was prepared to do without it because so why would you do that unless he was actually planning press reform? That's what I would say. Now, I don't want to sort of over-egg what press reforms we may get, but you would think one of two things. Either you just implement Leveson as it was, but I would argue against that. I would argue it needs updating. Because there are I've actually seen some decent journalists say, well, that's a couple of things that, could go wrong. And I would say it's a long time ago now, like 10 years. So do another one, have another review and act on those recommendations. Anyway, let's go through a few others because I've only barely started. Reinstated the housing targets. That's been done. Ring fencing water investment spending. That was a really important one. And again, unexpected for me. I expected Steve Reid to talk about the legislation that we know is coming. So we know some of Labour's plans for water companies. Ofwat to have the authority to withhold bonuses from executives of the worst polluting water companies. So they won't like that. The what was it now? Criminal charges coming online. Again, we'll see the detail of that. But for executives whose water companies continually break the law, personal consequences for them. Even being struck, like, what do you call it? Basically, some of these executives in Labour's original policy, although I don't think this one's in the manifesto, but that doesn't mean to say they're not doing this anyway, is that directors could actually be basically struck off, which means they can't even just go to another company in this country anyway. They have to bugger off somewhere else. Monitoring as well. So automatic monitoring of outflows and discharges and independently supervised, not them marking their own homework. So there's a lot of good things coming in. But when Steve Reid then also, because my worry was, so the water bills had to go up. Obviously they have to go up. People are going, oh, why do they have to go up? It's just paying for greed. It is paying for greed. But we also still need the investment. The investment is still needed. And it's like, where does the money come from? You can't say get the water companies to pay for it. The water companies don't have any money. They've got huge debts. They don't have money. The money they have been paying out has gone. 90% of shareholders in water companies are outside the country. The money's gone abroad. Bye-bye. It's gone. Finished. You can't get it back. It's not even fraud. You even if there was money in this country, you still couldn't recover it because it was allowed. It was legal. Just shouldn't have been. So the money's gone. We still need the investment. So people's bills had to go up. I will say not everyone's bills is going up a stupid amount. In fact, if anyone here has Wessex water, that's going down somehow. Is that a good one? Must be. It can't be bad. And also some of them, when you look at the bills, are not ridiculous. Like Scotland famously did not privatise its water. And some of the water companies, even in England, even with the price increase, will still be roughly the same as the bills that people are paying in Scotland. So it's not terrible for everyone, but it is terrible for some people. But, when Steve Reid announced it, that money's being ring-fenced. So we're not just letting the water companies have another chance to invest. He's saying, we don't trust you. So this is the money you've been apportioned for invest. Some of it will have just been inflation, just to pay staff more and stuff like that, extra costs. But some of that chunk has been set aside for investment. And Steve Reid has said, it will be audited and every penny will be spent on the investment you say you're going. Because they've submitted plans. You know, they have submitted plans for what they're going to do. So it says you'll spend it on that. And if there's anything left over, you'll return it to customers. Which surprised me. That was going, you know, much better. Are the Times Radio New Statesman okay media? I would say, yeah. I mean, you know, there isn't really any media I would say is 100% reliable. There are some that are better than others. Byline Times, I would probably put towards the top. Times Radio does have some interesting discussions. Remember, the people having those discussions, they're only people like me. They've got their own view on things and they don't feel the need. But I don't get the impression that they've got an agenda, that they're trying to con people. So when I listen to Times Radio, I do get the impression you've got people, they've got a certain perspective, which provides a bias. So it's not, but that they are at least trying to be objective. I get the impression they're not there trying to hoodwink you. They are actually having a genuine conversation as if there were no cameras and microphones around them. So they're decent. New Statesman, again, I would say largely okay. Yeah, relatively speaking. It's a low bar in this country. Why pay clean water rates when you're getting shit water? Because the money is needed to get rid of the shit. That's the problem, isn't it? But at least the end is in sight in terms of the piss taking. Which I know is a terrible... I keep saying it. I don't say it ironically. People keep saying, well, it is their job to take the piss. Yeah, I know. In a literal sense. But it's unfortunately just a phrase I use. The other thing I was really pleasantly surprised at was Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary, who has a particular interest in nationalising the railway. That's her thing. It's not only going to be her biggest reform, but you know, it's something that she personally feels very strongly about. And so we know Labour's policy is to and that'll be one of the bills in the King's Speech, because they have to legislate quite quickly, because the first rail company contract is up this October. So they need to get the legislation passed to bring them into public hands. So that'll be this summer. And but the idea is, as their contracts expire, we just take them into public hands. Now, that doesn't mean that at the end of it, the railways are nationalised again. That is just the rail companies. The railways will still be private. That's a different beast altogether. That could be a work in progress, I hope. But some of these contracts, I mean, there's like a contract up this year. There's a few contracts next year, some more in 2026. There are some contracts in 2030. So the whole process would go into the next Parliament. So then I hear that Louise Haigh is getting government lawyers to tell her, right, at what point has the service, because some of these companies are running a shocking service, at what point are they breaching their contract? Because what she's looking to do is to terminate contracts early where she can. Because if they breach their contracts, then, you know, they breach their contract. So effectively what she'll be doing is telling rail bosses, and she's been speaking, I think, to what she thinks are the worst offenders. And the choice appears to be either smarten up your service while your contract still runs, or the contract will end early. So that, again, was going a bit further than I expected. What are the consequences of letting water companies go bankrupt? Is it practical for Thames Water to go bankrupt? Have the government pick up the piece of cheap nationalisation? So the two barriers to just nationalising them. The first one is, and Louise Haigh ironically said that even though she's transport, but she said the same thing when asked. It was either earlier this year or last year, but I think it wasn't that long ago, I don't think. And she said the main problem is legislation. Because remember, you know, I've just said Labour are having to legislate to be able to bring the rail companies into public hands. They'd have to do the same for water companies. And there's a lot... there's a what was it now? There's a lot of parliamentary business needed for the legislation they want to push. So put it this way, like the King's speech next week is going to contain, we are told, about 30 bills. Now, that's a lot of legislation. Now, I know some bills can be bigger or smaller than others. That is a lot of legislation. Parliament's going to be rammed, absolutely rammed. water nationalisation is not one of those bills. That's not one of their priorities. Because if you were to do it, no one would notice the difference for years. So they need to prioritise the legislation that is going to be able to... Because remember, anything they do is going to take years before people see the benefits. There's some low-hanging fruit. There is some low-hanging fruit. But and one of those... I mean, one of the biggest things to get through early is workers' right, the new deal for workers, because that will boost people's pay, but even that will take time to filter through. So, yeah, legislation is a big, they haven't got the parliamentary time for it right now. The second problem is those debts. They don't want to do it by buying out shareholders and taking on those debts. Now, as to your specific question as if they let it go to the wall, does that mean they can nationalise it on the cheap? I hope so, but I don't know. So I'm not an expert in things like this, so I don't know where liabilities end up. And I haven't seen anyone that is an expert really discussing it at length. So I genuinely don't know. I would imagine that what Labour could do with Thames Water, but I'm not going to say, I mean, there'll be loads of gobshites on the internet say, oh, they could just do it as if it's really easy. What I'm hoping Labour can do with Thames Water is take it into public hands, not nationalise it. It's a different thing. A bit like that steelworks in Italy a few years ago, where the government took it into... It was quite a few years ago now, actually, now what I think about it, it's probably 10 years ago. But they took it into public hands while it recovered, and then they basically let it back into the wild again instead of nationalising it. So what I would hope happens, and I don't know how straightforward it is, manage it. So you're not technically nationalising it, you're just being the custodian of it. Sort it out, and then if a few years' time, when you've got it back on its feet, if all of a sudden then you do have you've got a bit of room within the parliamentary schedule, then start passing the legislation to nationalise water companies that fail. That's what I would like to see. But it must be done on the cheap. You cannot take those debts on, because then it's really this simple. National debt is always made such a massive issue that you just lose the next election. You just lose. Because you look like because people don't see the benefit for years. If you nationalise something, people will not see the benefit before the next election. And yet the media will happily show them the debt that was used to pay for it, and they will happily calculate for you how much extra in tax that's going to cost you for no benefit. That is the way it'll be presented. So it has to be done on the cheap. If Labour are wanting to build up our manufacturing industry, could this be a basis for deals with the EU in terms of raw materials and parts? It has to be. If we want to build up a manufacturing base, we need supply lines. So, I mean, the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention will be one way of doing that. That's something we can do. But yeah, we know that they're doing this really quickly as well. I mean, I've put at the bottom there, not missed a chance to discuss closer cooperation with the EU. It's not just that David Lammy went out seeing his counterparts in Germany, Sweden and Poland, but Keir Starmer, who attended the NATO meeting in America, he was asked why he's taken other ministers with him. And he said quite clearly, because I want to get talks start, because EU leaders are also NATO members. And he said he wanted to talk to EU leaders specifically, or he wanted his ministers talking to EU leaders about EU cooperation, and it would take months to set up these meetings ordinarily. So, despite the fact that some rejoiners don't seem very happy at the moment, Labour are going very, very, very quickly on repairing relationships. The blockage will be at the EU end, because they will understandably look at us as a country that reneged on our promises. I mean, we're still that country. We can look at it as we've got a different government now, but we are still the same country that broke our, not just promises, that broke agreements, treaties, international treaties. But we're trying to go a lot quicker than that. Other things that have actually been done, commitment to the BBC licence system. I mean, it's a thing, it's not necessarily a huge thing, but it's a thing that's been done. Some people may disagree with that. I'll keep pointing out, as bad as the BBC is, if you get rid of it, it will not be replaced by something better. It will be replaced by another GB News. That's what it'll be replaced with. So having a state broadcaster, I am a big supporter of. The BBC can be reformed, and the government have the power to reform it. Whether they do it right or not, I don't know. But they have the power to. But if you get rid of the BBC, if you defund it, then, and remember, the Conservatives, be suspicious of, I'm not saying everything the Conservatives do is bad for us, but be suspicious of anything the Conservatives do, and they have been defunding it. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the best programming has been dropped as a result. In particular, investigative reporting. So yeah, that's for me, that's an important one. Discussions with the BMA, which had a material impact. Remember, all the right wing were going, "Oh, we told you they would just do it for political purposes." Oh, Wes Streety goes out a word with me, hasn't even promised them more money, and they've stopped the strikes. It's like, that's all they asked the Tories to do. Remember, the BMA are not a militant union. Doctors don't strike very often. All they asked, okay, they're still not going to be happy if Wes Streeting doesn't cough up something, but all they asked for was talks, and the Tories denied them talks. They wouldn't talk to them. It's all they asked for. Same with the nursing unions when it came to that. All they asked for was talks, and they didn't get them for a long time. So they needn't give me that. The prison release plan, I think we actually have discussed. Banning that. So the pesticide that was, I can't remember the name of it now, but the one that kills bees, which is a right bastard for us. In fact, insect populations in general are like ridiculously low these days. I can remember, some of the older people here will remember as well. It's often pointed out. Young people, you won't even know what I'm talking about here. So let me explain. When I was younger and I was first driving, you would get I get screen wash right now. You got screen wash then. One of the selling points on the screen wash 20 years ago was, oh, this is really good for getting rid of the insects. And you think, what are you on about? Because when you drove down a road, a motorway or in the country or something, your windscreen would get covered in insects, just battering off the windscreen at high speed. So you wanted a screen wash that could like clean it off. You don't get that anymore. You don't see that on screen wash. Oh, really good at getting rid of splattered insects. It's not a selling point because you don't get insects splattering on your windscreen. Yeah, and that should worry people more than it does. A central part of our ecology is being wiped out, and bees are particularly important. So they've now banned that, as the EU already have. We've banned that pesticide. So that's a thing that has been done. I think I've gone through them now. So that's not bad for a week, really. I might have even missed something. Nova saying, is it strategic to offer to close our only strong point with the EU first before talking about trades we want? What do the EU get from talking trade after they've got the security deal? So I assume they have a plan, that Labour have a plan. Mike Galsworthy, I did do a video with him earlier this week, which actually did better than I expected it to. And his view is shows of good faith will yield something. And remember, David Lammy is not talking about a legally binding security agreement. He's just talking about an agreement. So in theory, anything that we do on security, and he said the reason is because it takes years to negotiate legally binding agreements. He wants something set up really quickly. So you could argue that although in theory, yes, we will be entering into these agreements and we may be front loading the thing that we have of value first. If it's not a legally binding agreement, it can always be withdrawn if we don't like, So it can still be used as a bargaining chip. So, I'm speculating here. You could argue that what Lammy is trying to do is demonstrate our value. So it's like, so we will agree this. It'll be off, it's like off the record type of thing. No formal agreement. We will agree to do this. We get working on that. That helps us start having conversations, because we're not having these conversations at the moment. You know, in Brussels right now, there are no British MEPs having conversations with others. So Europe doesn't really know what Britain wants, because there's no one telling them. And no one's been talking to them for years. So we're trying to establish those lines of communication. If we set up a security agreement, all of a sudden you've got lines of communication that go directly to the leaders of the EU as well as individual EU member states. And you know, if it's not legally binding, then it's not a commitment. You know, it's just cooperation we have. So arguably, again, just me speculating, arguably it's still a bargaining chip if you know, indeed that's what it's used for. And what base am I saying that removing the BBC will end up with it replaced by another GB News? Because people want news. People want news, and they will watch news. So if the BBC isn't there to watch, what is? It'll be privatised news, which is the likes of GB News. May not actually be GB News. I still hope that GB News disappears up its own arsehole. But it is what it is. Right, I'm just going to stop 1 minute because I've gone through my list. There's a question about free ports there. And I do know the answer to this. So will free ports be abandoned? So Labour have established their position on free ports. Jonathan Reynolds, I think it would be his area anyway. So Labour's position on free ports is they're not going to cancel anything that's already been set up, but they're not going to go ahead with anything new either, if that helps. That's what they've said. So in other words, they're not going to be seen to dismantle something that's already been set up, but they're not doing anything new. They're not going to extend it or anything. Could a second Trump term in America make the EU more welcome to another ally? Yes, 100%. In fact, you know, if you think about it, what caused even the Conservatives under Sunak to establish closer relations with the EU was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And a Trump presidency would do exactly the same again. It would bring us much closer, but I do not see that as a silver lining. Apart from anything else, Labour want that closer relationship anyway. I don't see it as a net or even a partial benefit. For Trump winning is like the most horrendous thing I can imagine, really. It could even be more damaging to the UK, never mind America, than Brexit. Yeah, it sounds terrifying. No bill to remove Kunzberg. No, I think people are suggesting the best way to remove her is just to stop watching. But there it is. Anyway, I'm just going to come back to a question. Let me just get rid of this. That Puddinator asked at the beginning. It was a very good question. So I did a video earlier on about how stopthetories.vote did. I got some facts and figures from them. And so Puddinator's asked here. So on my second video today, it says there is, because I was saying that people that did the postcode search, the vast majority of them will have been doing it so they could vote tactically. And, you know, a great many of them would have voted tactically. And he said, there is a reason to suppose someone who looked up the information on Stop the Tories but didn't vote, voter ID might have prevented someone who wanted to vote tactically from it. So I had considered that, and it was actually my original script. Unfortunately, my original script was massive, so I had to savagely chop it down. But I will tell you my thinking on that. First of all, as I already alluded to in the video, people looking up information on a tactical voting site are already at the most engaged end of voters. So they're not just your common or garden voter, they are the most engaged type of voter. Second thing is, stopthetories.vote had other advice on there. It was pushing the need for certain things like you need to register before this date and you need to check your voter ID and things like that. So I would argue, and again, this is an assumption of mine, but I would argue that the number of people who would have used a tactical voting site, because to use a tactical voting site, you have to be aware of what tactical voting is and all the rest of it, which suggests you're probably aware of a lot of other things related to voting. And because the site itself tried to push the idea of checking your voter ID. Before the deadline, it was quite prominent. Even if you check it out now, there are links to check your voter IDs right, but it's not as prominent because once the deadline was passed, there was no point in trying to remind people about it other than to take it. But it is still there. There's still a checklist if you were to go onto the site now and check it out. So it is possible some people would have missed it, and it's possible some people knew about tactical voting and were interested, but somehow didn't know about voter ID. But I would argue it's, and again, I can't, you'd need proper research to see whether these assumptions are fair or not. They're not tested out. But I think it's reasonable to suppose that the people using a tactical voting site are the most engaged voters, and the most engaged voters, particularly when that site itself pushed voter ID, would have known about it. So I don't think that would have been a huge number. But, I can't say for certain. I'm saying there, have I heard anything about what Labour are going to do about benefits? Only what they've announced, what's in the manifesto. I mean, the only new thing I would say, which is like bittersweet, is on the 2-child cap. Now, so the way I looked at it, so when Labour first, because obviously Starmer had a policy of, look, this is ridiculous, we should get rid of it, it's a terrible policy. And then Labour changed that policy last year. And it's a bit like the video I did today on the West Streeting thing. So with the West Streeting thing, it's just political risk he's playing with. The politically easy decision is to order another review, a proper one, a medical review, peer reviewed. But the 2-child cap does have a political side to it, in that, unfortunately, it's a well-supported policy. And amongst Labour members, Labour voters as well. This isn't just like, a decent chunk of the population in favour. No, Labour voters, not so much. Although there are also Labour members in favour of it as well. But I meant Labour voters. So it's a tricky. Now, I have complete faith that effectively by the end of this Parliament it will be gone. But you could see that. However, what changed for me was when Keir Starmer said that he actually does want to get rid of the policy. He wants to get rid of it. His argument is that he has to get the finances into the position to do it. So although a load of Labour MPs, and joined by other MPs, are going to put an amendment to the King's Speech to call for the cap to be removed, I would just remove it. The thing is, it's like, I mean, I know people are overblowing it, but it is considered by experts to be the single most effective way of raising a lot of people out of poverty. So I think the figure quoted was something like £1.3 billion cost, and it would instantly raise 250,000 kids out of poverty. Now, that's not even a quarter of the kids in poverty, by the way. That doesn't solve child poverty. Child poverty existed before the policy came in, and this policy doesn't eradicate it, and it doesn't even get rid of a quarter of it. So when Keir Starmer says the issue is complex, he's right, it is complex. But apart from anything else, that £1.3 billion cost, I don't know whether that takes into account the fact that some of that money would come back to the Treasury in the form of VAT anyway. Remember, any policy that involves giving money to people who don't have enough, because people who don't have enough money, you give them money, what do? They spend it because they don't have enough, right? And some of what they spend it on will have VAT applied, so it ends up back in the Treasury. So usually, like if you're talking about a tax break for a multinational corporation, yeah, you don't see any of that back. So there's no return on that. And Rachel Reeves has already talked about getting rid of those tax breaks. But anything you do to give to people on low incomes instantly creates an economic boost, because they're spending it in shops and they'll be spending it on local goods and services. And some of that money goes back to the Treasury in terms of VAT. So I don't know whether that 1.3 billion takes that into account. Is it 1.3 billion after you've taken into account how much is probably going to be spent on VAT? Or is it actually literally 1.3 billion, in which case it won't even cost that much? And to raise 250,000 kids out of poverty instantly. And also, if you've already said you want to get rid of it, it's like if Starmer said he wants to get rid of it, he's not worried about the fact that the policy is popular. And also, if you're going to get rid of it and you're going to go against public opinion, do it early. Do it in your honeymoon period where people are giving you like license to do whatever, right? Pretty much. I mean, I'm not saying there's nothing you can do to shit the bed, but so it just makes it really weird. Waranga Pagan saying, what do I make of Labour said on defence policies, hoping they cut out the middleman? Take this also like to be a point of close cooperation between us and the EU. I don't know. So, I mean, when it comes to military procurement, we're really bad at it. We're really inefficient. And it's because we end up, you know, buying stuff off the wrong people, but we do it in lots of areas as well. The NHS even do it too much. So I don't know about that one. I don't know enough about military procurement to really say, other than, you know, when you say cut out the middleman, you could also take out a level of check. I would just say we'll wait and see. I don't know enough, to be honest, other than to know that UK military procurement is ridiculously inefficient. And if you are a government who's looking at really tight finances and you are the Secretary of State, inevitably, of course, you're going to look for efficiencies. And there will be people saying, oh, yeah, we could save money by just doing this more efficiently. And new governments come in and do that all the time. And sometimes they're right. And sometimes they're not right. So I would just say, I don't know enough. Let's see, shall we? It can't be any worse. That's sort of my attitude to everything at the moment. The Labour are not going to do anything that is materially worse than the Tories were doing or were intending to do. But there are some things they could do as badly. Luke there going, devolution is important for a long time. We've been one of the most fiscally centralised nations in the democratic world. Do I think Labour will change this? Austin admits it with caution. So we know that Keir Starmer is very keen on devolution of powers, and a lot of regional decisions being made regionally. I will just point out that it is a double-edged sword, as we've seen this week. So, I mean, they're not going to devolve all decision-making. For example, things like energy projects and housing projects. If you leave all those to be purely decided locally, a lot of them won't happen. So there will be better devolution, but I strongly suspect, as we've seen this week, Labour will be hesitant to devolve powers where they know the NIMBYism will stop progress. So one area of devolution, like in England, for example, that's going to be really important. So especially as there's a lot of Labour metro mayors now, Labour are quite keen for them to take on like transport decision making. So obviously London has transport in public hands. Manchester does have its buses now in public hands, thanks to Andy Burnham. And there are a lot of there's certainly several other Labour mayors who've looked at Manchester and go, yeah, we fancy that. And they are now going to be helped rather than hindered to do so. But in terms of, like, if you're talking about devolution, greater devolution for, say, Scottish and Welsh parliaments and Northern Ireland Assembly. So Northern Ireland Assembly, I don't really know what difference it makes if they keep closing it down anyway. But in terms of the Welsh and Scottish Parliament, there were certain powers that when we exited the EU, came back to the UK, to Westminster, really should have then been devolved to Scotland and Wales at the very least, and we're not doing. So I do still think there is scope for further particularly for Wales. But I think even for Scotland, there were certain powers that Boris Johnson centralised that I don't think he should have done. But I mean, I would say Wales actually should see the greatest improvements, because Wales does not have devolution to the same extent Scotland does. So I see no reason why that shouldn't be equalised at the very least. I mean, Northern Ireland is a different case because they're not really functional a lot of the time. Like, even if Keir Starmer starts to get a load of deals with the EU to remove a lot of what unionists are concerned about with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that'll take a few years. I mean, I'm hoping we get to see something significant this Parliament, but agreements take years. Even if he does that, they'll just find something else to have an argument about in a few years' time, won't they? But there we go. Mike saying that up the cap by one child each year from 2025, over delivering the King's budget. I would just get rid of it. I would just get rid of it. We know there's an economic benefit in getting rid of it. It wasn't an economic policy. It was a political ideology that was crazy. This idea about people just having kids for the money. I mean, there's a few. It's really not very many. And do you know what? If you take that money off them, they're not economically active all of a sudden. For whatever reason. So it really is just a ridiculous policy. And for the cost of like £1 billion, particularly if we're getting better economic news, because Rachel Reeves, if GDP's, I mean, now is the time to strike, isn't it? You can say, oh, I could just do this thing because the economy's looking a bit better. And no, it's not going to throw her plans out. Because remember, these fiscal rules are based on this 5-year projection. There's absolutely no way it's going to muck about. At the next election, it's not going to have mucked about with those fiscal rules if they end it now. So I really hope... I'm losing hope because I'm pretty sure Keir Starmer is intending to put his... Well, Rachel Reeves. It's Rachel Reeves. But I'm not blaming her either. I mean, they must both have agreed to this. The government, should we say, do look like putting their foot down on this. But at least in this case, you can see a political argument. They're emphasising fiscal responsibility. The fact that there's nothing fiscally irresponsible about just getting rid of this cap is, is weird. But at least you can understand the political angle. Could they devolve powers on a use it or lose it basis because of dealing with NIMBYs? It's just too much. You're going to... No. I wouldn't bother. There's nothing wrong with devolving power. You don't have to devolve them en masse. Apart from anything else, you need to be building in... Like, if you devolve a power to whether it be a mayor or a local council, then they then need the people to be able to deal with the bureaucracy, don't they? So they need to take on more staff. So there's no particularly councils are struggling at the moment for funding. So, I mean, that's actually one of the urgent problems to deal with. Councils going to the wall. That hasn't stopped happening. So there is nothing wrong with devolving powers over time. And I would choose the ones where you have faith that a local region will make the right decision, or that they'll be motivated to make decisions in the interests of that region first, which is not going to be house building or energy projects, because they're of a more national importance as well. Like even like a local housing project all fits into a national picture, and some places don't want as much houses as others. So no, I would. The other thing as well is Labour can be really cheeky here, and they can, this would be hugely political, but I would do it, wouldn't you? So let's say you've got an area and you narrowly missed out, or you've won the seat, but you've got a tentative hold over it. You haven't won it by much, but you'd like to hold on to it. Now, let's say you build a load of houses there, and because your policy, remember, Labour's policy, obviously there needs to be legislation for this, I guess, but their policy is first-time buyers get first dibs on it. Because what Labour have said quite often happens is new housing estate built, an international group of investors buys them all those houses and then sells them at a profit, right? So Labour's policy is no, first-time buyers get first dibs. So first-time buyers probably more likely to be younger and therefore naturally Labour voting anyway. So build a load of houses where you've got either a realistic chance of taking the seat at the next election, or you have taken the seat but you haven't got a big majority. Build a load of houses there, get a load of younger people moving into them. Bosh, extra voters. Nice one. Which would be political chicanery, but at least it's political chicanery of a sort that actually delivers something we also need as a country, more houses. It's not strictly pork barrel politics where you're just flinging money at something to try and bribe votes. But I would do that. And I hope that Labour are really ruthless on stuff like that. Build the houses where you want a bit more, like, because those two policies go hand in hand. New builds and first time buyers getting first dibs. That means disproportionate number of new Labour voters going into that area. I would make use of that. And that means keep that central control over that. Energy projects are a national thing because obviously we all get our energy off the national grid. So everyone's a NIMBY on that one. Everyone wants the electricity, but they don't want it generated near them. So everyone's a NIMBY, so you have to keep that centrally controlled as well, at least for a long time. So I would keep those and just focus on devolving powers where you have faith that they will actually, like transport. Transport is entirely local and they need local transport. So that has lower risk of going wrong. Do we reckon that part of the training drive will be directed at builders for their house building project? If we want builders, we're getting them from abroad, mate. It's really this simple. I mean, this is where Labour do have genuine, where they have their biggest issue with really firing the economy up, I would say is not even Brexit. Brexit's obviously a big problem. Arguably the biggest problem is the completely backwards attitude we have to immigration. If you want to build more houses, if you want to boost any industry, we need more workers. So all right, the Tories telling people to have more babies, but by the way, we're going to shit on you if you lose your job and can't afford them because we're not going to give you any benefits, right? If Jacob Rees-Mogg somehow persuaded the nation to all get busy tonight and pump out a few babies, we're not getting a baby for 9 months at least, and we're not getting a worker for 20 years. So that's not really how our economy is going to get grown in the next 10 years or 5 years. It's going to be grown with migrant labour, as it always will be. In every economy, if you want an economy that can sustain a large retired population, you need immigration. In fact, actually, the other thing, although it's not something Labour have done, but it's something Labour have said. So they've talked. So social care is going to be a particular problem. Are Labour going to be able to do what previous governments have failed to do and deal with social care? It's a really tricky one. Labour have said they want to set, or Wes Streeting has said he wants to set up a royal commission and get a cross-party support for a plan. So in other words, Labour want to get other parties involved in saying, right, what are we going to do about this? But I'll tell you something, social care twice over needs immigration. Twice over. First of all, if you want the money for social care, because social care is really crap at the moment, if you want the money for it, you need an economy that's bigger than it should be for the size of the domestic population. So you need immigration. Secondly, you literally need immigration because who's going to staff social care? There's only so many British workers want to do social care. The social care sector, such as it is, utterly relies upon migrant labour, completely relies on it. It's low pay. It's, sometimes it's a terrible job. Absolutely awful. And you're absolutely dependent on migrant labour for it. So we need to, and I don't know how they're going to do it because it's really not straightforward. Because we are, as a country, You know, we keep saying we're sort of slightly left wing economically, but we are socially conservative, and that means being a little bit anti-immigration. And the media don't help. Jacob Rees-Moggs everyone in the media. Yeah, he hasn't stopped just because he's not an MP anymore, has he? In fact, he's got more time to talk shit everywhere else. What's my opinion on the proposed national care service? Well, as I've just been saying there, the proposal, as I understand it, is to try and get other parties involved in agreeing. And I approve of that, by the way. I did say before the election, I do hope Labour, because they've got a large majority, like Keir Starmer now has all the power. Well, as long as his MPs are happy to have him all the power. But Labour have all the power, should we say. Labour are now in the position the Tories have been in for the last few years. They have, you know, on a minority, or even a smaller minority of the vote, 100% of the power. They can do what they like. They can do exactly as they like. And I did say, I hope on some of the tougher issues, at least, that they reach out and work with other parties. So, yeah, I approve of this idea. But that also means that effectively, if we're going to try and get a cross-party commission to work on a plan, we don't technically have one at the moment. I mean, I know Labour just have an idea of what it wants to do, but I mean, it is a really tough one. It's not easy. There isn't, I mean, where's the money going to come from? Where's the workers going to come from? That's the problem you have to solve. Doesn't matter what system you come up with for expanding social care to make it fit for purpose. Where's the money coming from? Where are the workers coming from? I mean, we know where the workers are coming from abroad, so how do you deal with that politically? Actually, ironic as well, isn't it? Isn't it ironic? Most of the people, not all, but most of the people who need social care are elderly, and they're like the most anti-immigration of the lot. It's like the people who need the immigration are the most anti. That's how messed up a country is when it has a privately owned media feeding people absolute rubbish all the time. Anyway, we've run out of time. I have to go through some questions quite quickly. Wangapeg is saying, before my back and knees gave in, I qualified as a bricklayer, plasterer and carpenter. Though likely many of us myself, a bit less of a crap situation these people could do with help. Yes. And again, the question for any sort of care like that is just, where's the money? Where's the workers? The money, you need to boost your economy beyond the capacity of a domestic population. So you need immigration. Where do the staff come from for the social care? Immigration. So we need to actually, I mean, we're never going to embrace immigration, let's be honest. It's not going to happen. But we do need to be able to manage it politically at least. Because otherwise we're shackling ourselves. Do you consider pensioners contribute lots to charities, social care, childcare, food banks and so on? So in addition to immigration, you need the volunteers who are pensioners. But that's the thing, we shouldn't. We shouldn't. Because some pensioners can't afford to do that. Actually, quite funny. I'll just make as my last point something I was saying to my fiance today. So we were talking about like people who in like areas out like ours. It's a Tory area. Now we've got a Labour MP now, but that's just because of the boundary changes. It wouldn't have been otherwise. But where I am, the bit I am is quite conservative. And, you know, there are people around here that are nice people, good people. And, you know, there's a lot of charity work goes on around here. The food bank's really good. And I constantly think to myself, no, I don't go around asking all these volunteers if they vote Conservative. But some of them must vote Conservative. And I just think to myself, so you're voting Conservative, which creates the needs for these charities. And then you're volunteering for these charities. It's like you're voting to put people in poverty. And then you're spending your time trying to sort of alleviate a little bit. It's a bit like Rishi Sunak and the Windsor Framework. Remember, the Windsor Framework didn't do anything for us. It was a way of limiting the damage that his party did with Brexit. And that's somehow I see, like you know, Conservative voting volunteers of charity. You're voting for the deprivation and then giving up your time to sort of limit the damage. And it's the same with elderly people. I just think, you know, you're against immigration, but doing so screwing you over. It's mad. Immigration seen through an imperious mindset. Well, it is in this country, yeah. But it's just mental. Well, it's not. It's actually worse than that. I actually think it's worse than that. It's this, you know, they pushed on this fear of like, oh, you know, because when you get to a certain age, you don't really like change. Like, I'm already at the age I don't like new music. You know, people talk to me about things like, I couldn't name a Taylor Swift song. I don't listen to new music these days. It's shit. I am at that age now. I'm at that age. Don't worry, I'm not turning conservative. If anything, I get more left wing as I get older. But but you know, elderly, they don't like the change. Oh, they're bringing in all these cultural changes. It's like, yeah, they're not hurting you. The food's getting better. They're not hurting you. But anyway, there it is. Food banks closed at the weekend. Apparently, you don't get hungry on Saturdays or Sundays. I mean, you know, as long as they're open at regular times, you don't just go in for one day, do you? The problem is when it has to shut unexpectedly, like for an election. You know, when I saw that sign, Hornsby, I think it was, where it said closed for the election, it's like, oh, shit. But there we go. But anyway, we'll leave it there. We've gone over it there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a very good evening, and until next time, I'll see you later.